Welcome to episode 3. We're deep in the 60s at this point. Please subscribe and like our episodes. We want to know what you think, so leave your comments below. The 60s in America are marked by a war, the Vietnam War, and the draft that went with it. Right now, you're sitting in your class, but graduation is looming. At that point, the unknown part is, will you be drafted? In 1965, in a small farming town where the population gained 1,000 people in 10 years, will they be aware of the war? Will it affect them the same? Even my Google search didn't turn up 1% articles about the draft or the war. Each generation is affected by the same 4 things. These children of the greatest generation will now lose their friends and brothers in a war.
It was Benoit Air Base, south by Saigon. Did their bombing missions or rocket attack all the time. It's a year I remember, that's for sure.
They have to get over the war, but will they? We can only talk to people who are still with us. The rest have gone. Do you remember any guys, someone you dated, or just the guys in your class saying?
I remember a couple of them that were drafted, and more the upperclassmen, because I graduated in '67. There were people in Vietnam that I knew from our class, and unfortunately there's a young man, a man who was a prisoner of war who they never did find.
Is that Gary LeBond?
Yes.
Well, the draft, when I first I knew it was going on, but it hit when I was in college, okay? And the first thing they talked about was the lottery. That's when the lottery came out. And I remember being in the dorm, and the dorm was just full of guys, and we were all watching the TV, and they were picking the numbers. And I remember my number to this day. It was 115. Well, I was from Oakland County, and Oakland County was fairly heavily populated, and so a lot of people said, you'll probably never get called, and I didn't. But there were people in the room that got called, and I remember the bus coming to our campus and picking up these kids to take them down to the draft board and sign them up, and if they were, eligible to go, those people ended up going. I remember kids coming back at college. They would come in, and some of them would go up and get a 12-pack every day and just sit in their room. Other ones were more talkative, but they were only there for a semester, and then they were gone. And we had a few that came out to play football. We knew they were older because they were like 20 in their middle 20s,
right?
But they didn't stay. Some of them, I remember a couple that, made it through the whole 4 years, but there was other ones that they were gone.
Well, I was going to Washtenaw Community at the time, and they started the lottery system, which was pretty scary because you never knew when your number was going to get drawn. And I already had, buddies that were over in Vietnam. And anyway, I had a semester left at Washtenaw, and I paid my tuition, and everybody said, well, my 2S was going to run out at the end of that semester. And they said, well, just join the National Guard. So they said they won't take you for 6 months or so. So I thought, oh, okay. So I signed up for National Guard, and a week later I get a letter, a certified letter, telling me I had to report for my physical and everything. I can't really remember anybody that actually died there. Well, that was a very touchy subject for all them guys that came back. I mean, I had some really close friends that went over there, and honestly, they were never right. They were the same after that, and we never talked about it. They didn't want to talk about it. Well, at the time, they were shunned. They were, people treated them like, it was awful. These guys went over there, people are dying for the country. And
I knew a guy in Northville, my husband, and he wasn't crazy about going, but he got his draft notice. He didn't go to Vietnam then. He was still on alert to go. He was stationed in Virginia, so I went down there and we got married. We can't have any more family members down here. We have to be on alert to go, and so you have to go home.
How about James McElvoy?
2 years ahead of me, so he would have been in 61. He wasn't the only one in our town. Gary Laban was another one that was missing in action and was killed over there. And his sister was in my sister's class. She did everything to the state or the government to find his remains, but both of them were quite well known in school.
I think I knew about it before I turned 18 because the law was you had to register for the selective service.
Did you have a brother? Did he talk about it with you?
Oh yeah,
Oh,
yes.
yeah.
So yeah, Steve, Steve got his draft notice. He graduated from college on a Saturday. He got his draft notice that Monday in the mail, and he was off to the Army. Yeah.
I mean, as a freshman, if you don't make your grades and you become ineligible, the school will ask you to leave and your number comes up, correct? Is that right?
Yeah. So my freshman year ends, to come home and work, and I've got a terrible cold that I thought, man, I can't shake this, so I'm going to go to our local doctor. So I think you might have pneumonia, so let me take an X-ray. I took an X-ray. I went back to work. He calls me later that day and said, Mike, I need you to come back in the office. I said, why do I need to come back? He said, I think you have active pulmonary tuberculosis. So I said, okay. So I went back in to see him, and he said, I've already made an appointment for you at the Oakland County Health Department. I went, and he says, you have tuberculosis. And I said, wow, is it gonna kill me? And he said, no, I'm gonna need you to come back and get shots 3 times a week. But can I get them from my local doctor? And he said, no, you can't do that. He says, I can put you in the asylum here, and you can live there. I said, no, that's fine. I'll drive back 3 times a week. But I lost my student deferment, so I couldn't go back to school in the fall. So I went back to school in January of 71, and I got my physical notice to go down to Fort Wayne in Detroit to take a draft physical. And it didn't get done until 4 in the afternoon, and the last person that everybody sees is a medical doctor. And I said, I've been carrying these things around all day. Nobody wants to see. He looked at it, and we talked a little bit about what my prognosis was. I said, well, I don't have TB anymore. I think I was just about to get out of school when I got a notice from the selective service that said I was 4F, so I wouldn't be drafted.
One brother was ineligible and the other one was lucky enough to get a high number. It didn't hit me personally very closely, but my brother Mike went to Michigan State. Mike's roommates at the time, one of them enlisted and another one got drafted. I don't remember anybody from my high school class, which was actually a pretty small class. Mm-hmm. We only had 100, maybe because of the fact that my brothers were, relatively safe from having to be involved. It wasn't front and center to me at the time.
Well, after my freshman year, I transferred back to Western. And I went to my sophomore year at Western, and this would be 64, 65, excuse me, school year. So I was 18 and a half, and so I didn't go back to school after my sophomore year. They didn't want me back for some reason. And so then all of a sudden, you're dealing with the draft, and at that time, Gretchen and I thought we were in love. And she was up at Michigan State. That was part of the reason I transferred back to Western. And we, I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, I don't want to get drafted and go in the Army. I said, I'm going to join the Air Force. So I went through that whole process of joining the Air Force and found out, at the very end of it, when I went to take the oath in 1965, that they had rejected me because I had 3 metal screws in my leg from getting hit by a car out at Griswold and 10 Mile Road. Then the next minute, they weren't taking me at all. So it changed my whole life. And it was
Yeah.
and I felt kind of bad in a way because I knew there were guys out there going and friends that got drafted, got enlisted, all kinds of stuff. And
Are you guys aware of James McElvoy or Gary Laban?
yeah,
Sure.
those kids, we all went to school with them.
Oh,
Gary was a year older, Jim was 2 years older, and Jim's sister Glenda was in our class.
Good looking
Okay.
guy.
I knew him, knew
Yeah.
he wasn't in town because it was a small town,
What was the draft in America?
I was in high school, and one of the classmates was going to drop out of school and join the Navy. But I thought to myself, wow, that is a big move, because I thought, why are you doing that?
Are your fellow classmates and you hearing that, oh, we graduated and so-and-so got drafted? Are you hearing this?
Yeah.
So when they call you, you can go and sign up before they draft you.
Yeah, I was in when the lottery started, and they just picked out a block, let's say 200 people, and if your number was in that, you were gone. Yeah, well, Steve Sharman and I went down to Fort Wayne in Detroit for the induction physical. Had people in a big gymnasium there. They said count off in twos, so everybody 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and number 1 people take 1 step forward, and so they did, and they said, congratulations, you're now members of the United States Marine Corps. And so that's where they went. And I said, well, I've already decided what I'm going to do. I'm going to join the Air Force, and this is what I'm going to, this is my plan. So, and I did get my induction physical, but I was already in the Air Force. I went into the Air Force and ended up, I was in law enforcement and securities, but I ended up being assigned to Texas it's my first duty station in Lockmore Air Force Base. Went from there, I went to Southeast Asia. It was Benoit Air Base, south by Saigon. Did bombing missions or rocket attack all the time. It's a year I remember, that's for sure.
In other words, they would try to destroy the base
Correct.
that the Air Force had built.
See, it was easier to get the planes on the ground than it was to get them in the air. So they would just rocket and mortar the base, and you just waited. It was usually around 2 o'clock in the mornings when we had a siren that would go off, and that was when the base was under attack. Well, what I had to do was defend the base, and most of the people just went to bunkers. We had bunkers all over to hide and stay protected in. They tried to breach the East Gate, the military police. We were restricted to base. So we weren't allowed to leave the base for the whole year. So Benoit was here, the air base, and then we had an army base also, which was Long Bend. And that's where the jail was for anybody
that got picked up. Who were in high school? Did the fellas in your classes?
Yeah, they were all worried about
Oh,
their
okay.
numbers and stuff, and they would come, they'd pull numbers the night before on the TV, and the guys come, and then some of the kids did go, and didn't come back too, but the guys were really always worried, and the girls were always glad we were girls.
Do you remember thinking about the draft in high school?
Oh, yes. So I spent 4 years and 2 terms there, and I thought, this is getting to the point where I'm getting enough credits, I gotta graduate. So I graduated March 18th, 1967, and I came home, and guess what was on the dining room table?
Your impending doom.
My draft notice. I was drafted the day I graduated.
How did they know that?
They tracked everybody.
Okay.
Yeah. So I had roughly 2 weeks left, and I got on a train and went to Fort Knox, Kentucky, and started 2 years of the Army.
So did you have to go to Vietnam?
No, I came down on a levy for Korea. And I went, I don't know about Korea. And said, no, we're going to send you to Thailand. I was shipped off to Thailand. It was probably the best duty ever.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was a clerk typist. I was there a little under a year. While I was in the Army, a lot of guys got drafted younger than I was, and I knew them. One that stood out was Jimmy McElvoy. He was killed in action. His wife at the time was Maureen Knoll. That would be Johnny Knoll's daughter. She was a year older than I, so was he. And it was just sad because he was just a good guy, just a good guy.
We watched it probably more than anybody else. I do remember my brother was very, very pro-American, My brother passed away in Vietnam. My brother was a career pilot in the Air Force, finally flying a F-4 Phantom, and flying the Ho Chi Minh Trail and rifle from the ground or machine gun through the canopy and got him. But the navigator and got it back down over by Saigon and the ocean, and he was able to eject both him and my brother. They recovered my brother all right enough. I mean, he spent 20 years in the Air Force. I was getting very close to being drafted, but being in college didn't make any difference. They gave me a 2S, but I went down and had my physicals done, things like that. At the same time, in Plymouth, where our draft board was, it burned down. My mother calling me and saying that they said, if it is handy, please come in and re-register, but you do not have to. We have duplicate records in Washington. I never heard another word. So I never tried to get out of the draft. They just never called me.
What are your recollections of maybe other older siblings or older cousins who might have been involved in?
I did find out that my mother had a cousin actually died there. I found his name on the wall in Washington, D.C. When I graduated in 1968, draft was a big concern. If you were a college student, you had a deferment. It was called a 2S, and I kept my 2S deferment for 2 years. My second year of college, they did the first draft lottery, and everybody got a number, and my number, believe it or not, happened to be 365. By the time I graduated from college, I was married, I had a child, and the war had wound down by then. But so, a lot of my classmates served. We didn't lose any of our classmates in the war. I mean, we had some bad experiences.
Even kids in your age group were aware of the two MIA South Lyon boys, Lyon and
right.
McElvoy.
As far as Gary Laban, I remember very much when his helicopter went missing. And really his mother and sister were instrumental in the MIA nationally, I believe. I do know that at one time they planted a memorial tree in his name in front of what was then City Hall. Everything you hear about returning veterans, how they were mistreated, the war had become such a downer.
Yeah.
And it's good that they're finally getting their due.
When I got out of high school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. My dad was a military man. I can remember it in the front yard in San Mateo, California. He said, well, they still have the GI Bill. What's that? I said, well, you join the Army for 2 years and they'll pay part of your college. Oh, great. So I went down there to recruiting office. And being as smart as I am, I joined the Air Force for 4. Well, Vietnam and Korea had just ended up, and Vietnam really hadn't got hot yet. The Far East. I was in Formosa. I had a crypto clearance, which is higher than top secret. I was in China for 30 months. We had bases there, so I was in cryptography, which we were in charge of keeping track of the Chinese Communist Air Force. I'm out of service. been out a couple years, and Bay of Pigs happened, and the Air Force sent me a telegram. You are on 24-hour alert. You can be gone at any time. I said, I don't need this, but it never happened.
But when you start coaching these young men, were they worried about their?
Most of them were not. Most of them didn't even come up. Maybe among themselves somewhere, but not with adults around, coaches or other people. They didn't even, unless.
Like, did they want their kids to go and fight and be proud, or did they want them to?
Parents would say something about it once in a while in a conference. It wasn't so much in the kids, but you would talk to them if they wanted to talk about it. Didn't want to go. If they got drafted, fine, you have to go. But if you don't get drafted, no, don't go. Stay away. But it was not a nice war.
It was so long. And the Vietnam War.
I was aware of the war, not so much of the draft, but aware of the war until I got maybe a year into college, and I realized some of my friends, the kids that I graduated with, were off to the war. Tommy had a cousin killed in the war, and he got caught in the draft. And so it was, because it was so far away, you could almost forget the horrors that were happening, especially if you didn't watch the news, because it wasn't the talk among college people at that point in time. When we became acutely aware of it is when Tom and I were married. He had was finishing his bachelor's degree, and he had gotten his 1A status. But I was in South Lyon, Michigan. That wasn't the banter of the day.
This brave young man, who apparently Gary Laban.
Oh yes, his sister. I graduated with his sister.
The one that's been trying to find his remains?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Luann Laban, and she has always tried to find that. It's just a sad, sad situation. And he was a nice guy.
Oh.
Just a really nice guy.
Coming up, question 4. Let's go back to high school. Let's talk about girls and boys and love and hate. Let's talk about running away from the cops. Please subscribe and like our channel. See new episodes every Friday, only on YouTube, 12 o'clock. When my friends and I were young and stupid, and we would often get into trouble, make a mistake, we'd say to each other, someday we're going to look back and laugh. And I'm happy to say that, yeah, I've done that a lot. I hope that some of these stories make you laugh and remember the good times.